and articulate India-Iran connections. We've had one discussion on cinema. We've had one discussion on cinema, one on music, and this is the third one. We are going to have two coming up that will be about methods in cultural research more specifically. And the next one, I think, has two anthropologists in it. We also have a historian coming up who talks about the East India Company and its work in Persia. So yes, this is a really exciting series. My warm thanks on behalf of the Center for Inter-Asian Research to Darush Rahmanian and Pooya Nekoi of the Madhum Name People's History Journal based in Iran, Tehran. And a very, very warm welcome to Professor Mana Kia at Columbia University, who is going to be the speaker of the day. I will let Darush say a few words about his institution, then I will introduce the speaker and moderate the discussion. Go ahead, Darush.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Darush Rahmanian, and I am the editor-in-chief of Madhum Name People's History Journal. I would like to thank and welcome you all to the third session of the joint seminar series between Madhum Name and the Center for Inter-Asian Research at Ahmedabad University. As usual, I would like to thank all the organizers, Professor Niranjana, her colleagues, and my colleague Pooya Nekoi. And I would especially like to thank Professor Mana Kia for agreeing to join us today to speak about her excellent and wonderful book, The Persianate Selves. I look forward to her presentation. Thank you so much, Professor Niranjana, and many, many thanks to dear Mana Kia. Thank you.
Should I speak? Sorry.
Give me a second. I'll just introduce you. Sorry. I'm sure all of you have read the poster and the publicity, and which is why you're here. Thank you for this wonderful turnout for Professor Mana Kia's talk. She's an amazing scholar whose work rearticulates the kind of connections that we have in the region, across the Persianate region, if you like. She's taken the 18th century as the turbulent 18th century, as she calls it, as the time space, if you like, from which one can ask these questions. Is there something like a proto-nationalist community? Is the nation state a completely modern invention? If so, what was there before the nation state? Why does the nation state claim a certain authenticity or specificity of culture? What happens when this kind of question is confronted by something like adab, which is part of the larger Persianate word, a whole way of dealing with other people, with the world, with your place in the world, and all of these things. I think that this is an amazing work. I'm sort of mostly halfway through the book. And I think this is going to be a really exciting talk for all of us, especially those of us logging in from India, where we sort of live with the Persianate idiom all the time without recognizing it as such. I think this will be very enlightening for us. Professor Mana Kia is teaching at the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian and African Studies at Columbia University. She looks at connected social, cultural, intellectual histories of West, Central and South Asia from the 17th to the 19th centuries. This book that she's basing her talk on today, Persianate Selves, Memories of Place and Origin Before Nationalism, has just come out. And she's also published a number of book chapters and articles on travel writing, gendered concepts of modernity, and various aspects of trans-regional Persianate culture. She's now working on a second book, and I just can't wait to read that one, outlining the idea of adab as culture and how it was socially and politically enacted in the trans-regional circulation of people, texts, practices, and ideas between Iran and Hindustan. Professor Mana Kia, over to you.
Thank you so much for this generous introduction. I just wanted to take a minute to thank Tejaswini Niranjana and the Center for Inter-Asian Research at Ahmedabad University, and to Dariush Rahmanian and Mardom Name Journal for the invitation, and to Puya Nikui in particular for getting the conversation started. It's my honor to present on my recent book as part of a lecture series focusing on interconnections, which is, the sort of focus of my book. So let me share my screen. I have a PowerPoint to kind of help us through some of the things I'm going to talk about. Okay, so this is the cover of the book. I know, this is a largely Iranian and Indian audience, but let me provide some background since some of what I'm going to talk about is part of a lesser told history. So perhaps you might know that Persian was a dominant language of the Islamic East, and it was used by Muslims and non-Muslims alike. And increasingly, from about the 13th to the early 19th century, it was the language of power and learning across Central, South, and West Asia, used for government, philosophy, Sufi literature, historical commemoration, storytelling, poetry, and ethical literature. And that doesn't mean that it was the only language, but it was a very important language in a resolutely multilingual environment. As a result of this linkage, a heavy and continuous circulation of people, texts, practices, and ideas connected something that we can call Persianate Asia. And that much is very well outlined in a variety of scholarship. Okay, so my book is not the story of empires, but here is the political state of things in about 1700. So the part that is my contribution is what I argue that we must understand from the kind of trans-regional linkage, that this mobility sustained a shared cultural hermeneutics across these regions that could be taken up by rulers to form imperial ideologies, utilized by merchants in everyday transactions, or invoked by mendicants in their peregrinations. So this is often talked about as a kind of realm of elites, but I actually think that this is a concept that needs a little bit of interrogation because it has a lot of modernist assumptions. And I do think actually some of the things I'm going to talk about were definitely shared across different strata of society, right? Maybe not the same across all strata of society everywhere, but it was not something that was, limited to a few nobles and royal people. So one of the things that I emphasize is that Persianate sensibilities had to be acquired because one was never born with them. Persians were thus a kind of person who had received a particular form of basic education that imparted the Persianate. And one translation of this has been in a review, Farsi Madar. So this basic education, and I focus on basic education and not the kind of refined, specialized education that very educated people received. This form of basic education that imparted the Persianate was kind of how people understood and engaged with the world. It was a textual corpus whose encapsulated meanings also lived and circulated orally in stories and in verse for broader audiences. So Persians learned adab, and I'll talk about this more, through these verses and stories, which basically imparted how to behave at appropriate moments with gratitude or generosity, for instance, when it was called for and towards whom. So adab was the proper form of things and of being in the world. So this concept of proper aesthetic and ethical forms of thinking, acting, and speaking, and thus of perceiving, desiring, and experiencing, provided the coherent logic of being Persian. So adab as many of you probably know, existed in other language traditions as well: Arabic, Turkish, Urdu, and a host of vernacular languages. But each tradition had its particular figures, idioms, and stories, even as it often shared them. So they weren't radically distinct, but they were not identical either. And this reflection, right, of both what was shared and what was different is a reflection of what were often multilingual social contexts of Persianate Asia and also larger Islamic and Asian worlds. So here is the painting that I used for the cover of my book, and it's from the early 17th century commemorative text of Akbar Shah, the Timurid ruler of Hindustan. And it remembers how Akbar's father, Humayun, sought refuge in Safavid Iran with Shah Tahmasp, who gave him the support to get his kingdom back. And here and in the book, I use the term Timurid to identify the dynasty usually called Mughals, since a Mughal was a term used historically to identify a wider group of people. So I'll speak more about that later, but using less commonly used names is a methodological strategy that I use to dispel problems that come with the translation of this history, both into English and into the modern context. So this episode and the relationship it created were commemorated in complementary and contested ways through the decades that followed, all the way through the 18th century, some of which I detail in the book. The adab required by this relationship, depending on how it was depicted, was a potent site for political and moral claims of the two empires, which sort of culminated in Nader Shah's evocation of it as the basis for his invasion of Hindustan in 1739. In this particular representation of this moment in a trans-regionally known text, Tahmasp perceives Humayun in front of his capital of Ghazvin. It's a site of seamless coming together in the form of a shared culture and also of contestation. In this version, Humayun wears his own cap, his own royal cap, rather than the Safavid Taj he controversially was said to have accepted in exchange for Tahmasp's help, right? Both rulers are depicted as sitting next to each other, closely turned towards one another in intimacy, and both hold the handkerchiefs that would have identified them as beloveds and masters of this audience, foregrounded and framed as they are in the picture by their entourages. I thought the simultaneous, homologous, and contestational work of the image made a perfect cover for the book. So this is perhaps a better map, and it's the one from my book, which I took pains to have drawn without political borders, but with cities and domains large and small that are discussed in the book outlined. So with this map kind of in front of you, I wanted to kind of pull back and explain that the main question animating my work broadly is what kinds of histories, meaning worlds, ties, and divisions do we see when we look beyond nationalist and regional frames to the thick and deep pasts connecting various parts of Asia together? And I realize that speaking of connections across Persianate Asia runs the risk of romanticizing a cosmopolitan pre-modern. But I was writing in the context of scholarship that assumed divisions, and knowing what was shared seemed essential to a truly historicized understanding of what was not. So the term Persianate, which is very much an English language term, has been used in a variety of ways to describe the distinct political and cultural formations and their intellectual and literary corpuses, characterizing Eastern Islamic domains. And when I began my work, Persian studies was located in and bifurcated by regional studies divisions. So the domain of Persian was part of the Iranian national subset of Middle East studies, and Persian and South Asian studies, called Indo-Persian, was treated separately, both from Persian in the Middle East and also somewhat from things Indic. Although trans-regional studies are gaining prominence in their own right, these national and regional divisions are still institutionally entrenched and reflected in bodies of scholarship that seldom overlap. So new critical attention is slowly enriching this conversation, but methodological nationalism casts a long shadow on historical studies that my work seeks to dispel. So the Persianate was an opportunity to think through an intermediate scale of analysis, somewhere between regional and global. And I gained a lot of inspiration from other kinds of intermediate scales that overlapped with the Persianate, like Indian Ocean studies and land-based intra-Asian studies. So when I began reading Persian texts from the 18th and early 19th century, and I started with travel texts and then other kinds of commemorative texts, I also saw some disjuncture with the scholarship that existed at the time. Much of what I read, and remember this was a long time ago, this was over a dozen years ago, still evaluated the period before the rise of a colonial modernity with categories, terms, and understandings belonging to this later period. And this seemed limiting to me because categories are important. And if you begin with too many assumptions, you generally find what you're looking for. You also risk obscuring everything else that doesn't fit with these assumptions and might change the meaning of what you end up with. And anyway, as Sheldon Pollock has pointed out, how can we know what colonialism and its forms of knowing changed if we don't know what was there before? So the work I did in part was dedicated to clearing conceptual ground to be able to even speak about what I was interested in. So the main issue that I tackle is the way nationalism links a society defined by geography to a particular culture and political history. And this allows us to imagine a seemingly natural link between land and language, and by extension, people and culture. But Persian as a language of a place we call Persia is a product of European languages, right? Since Persia doesn't exist in any of the other languages. And it's a confusion that I avoid by calling the place Iran, just to distinguish it from the language. This link is also upset by the historical importance of various forms of Turkic, not to mention other vernaculars as a spoken language in Iran. So we can't assume that Persian is the, something called a native language of a place called Persia, right? This is also a very multilingual place. And I've chosen to use Hindustan to refer to India, for instance, to create some distance between India as a colonial construct and later nation state and the historical meaning of this place. And this distinction has since been well elaborated by Manan Ahmad in his book, The Loss of Hindustan. So Persianate Selves presents an argument about what place and origin meant for Persians between Iran and India in the 18th century, between the fall of the Safavids in 1722 and when the British abolished official use of Persian in Hindustan in the 1830s. This is the end of what I call the High Persianate period, the end of that kind of roughly 13th to 19th century period, when Persian sort of reached its broadest scope in many ways. And specifically, I outline how the expansive and multiple notions of place and origin allowed for a range of possibilities of collective affiliation, out of which pre-modern Persianate selves grew, right? And in doing this, I bring together works usually understood as separate genres, and these include biographical compendiums or tazkeras, travelogues, histories, memoirs, and poetry under the heading of commemorative texts based on their shared imperative of commemoration, as well as common forms and features, which include to various degrees a reliance on biographical representation. So for instance, we can argue that the Akbarnameh is a chronicle, a history, but it is also in many ways a very elaborate biography of Akbar. But modern forms of biography and history are structured by the prerogatives of positivism, based on ostensibly objective documentation as full and true, which is kind of understood to be mutually exclusive of what is untrue. By contrast, recording what happened was only one concern of commemorative texts. The subjects of commemoration could be understood in more than one way, and the meanings of these representations were conveyed in the manner of their telling, right? Thus, texts commemorated events, stories, and biographical subjects in a variety of styles and forms, giving rise to multiple versions of the same subject. This multiplicity stands in contrast to singular truth, which is the focus of modernity's objective history. The same overarching logic of diversity, of difference legible as coherence, governed the range of possible conceptions of place and origin. Ultimately, and I'll give you examples later on, I argue that multiple places and origins, a diversity understood as proper and necessary, constituted a range of Persianate collectives and their selves that crossed modern boundaries. So pre-nationalist Persians were often from many lands, religions, occupations, social locations, and even genders, though these boundaries possessed aphoretic, meaning porous, rather than mutually exclusive categorical distinctions that require reassessment of their historical meanings. So this is a table of contents of the book, and I'll just sort of run through the structure of it quickly and give some examples from each of the sections. So the central premise of place, section 1 of the book, is that the overarching logic of modern empirical geography was only one possible mode of knowing place. Because it was embedded in and continuous with other modes of knowing place that were different and even undermined empiricism, we cannot view it as definitive. And the 3 chapters in this section address the significance of different scales of place, the possible modes of placemaking, and the way places were invested with meaning. So chapter 1, Landscapes, begins by outlining the flexibility and multivalence of terms. It distinguishes common ways of understanding units of geographical place, such as kingdoms and provinces, from effective notions of place, such as homelands. The chapter then parses the ways places were marked and measured. Chapter 2, Remembering, Lamenting, illustrates the role of commemorating the near and far past in attributing meaning to 18th century presence, marked by the fall of the Safavid Empire and the devolution of Timurid power for Persians in and between Iran and Hindustan. Different interpretations of contemporary events evince remarkably similar understandings of lands, geographies, and their relations to other places, all with reference to proper ethical forms in learning, service, rulership, social interaction, and piety. So chapter 3, Placemaking and Proximity, looks at the cartographic effects of meaning making and features of place that lent them a moral cast. Widely recognized features of urbanity, learning, just rule, and the storied tradition of Persian and Islamic narratives connected the universal with the local and particular. Transregionally circulating commemorations of place created a morally imbued sense of familiarity and proximity that was very often more significant than empirical geographical contiguity. Other features of place could create a gradient of familiarity with places within and beyond Persianate and Islamic lands. So let me give you an example of one way that this proximity was created from this chapter. So when the Timurids conquered Kashmir and incorporated it into their North Indian-based empire in the 17th century, they presented it as paradise-like. They then extended its heavenly nature, seen in its lush greenery and temperate climate, further adorned with gardens and pavilions, to characterize the whole of the empire. And one of my teachers, Sunil Sharma, who's also a native son of Ahmedabad, has written a book about this called Mughal Arcadia. So this characterization as the exemplar of paradise on earth became a defining ornament of Kashmir as a place and incorporated it into universal Persianate knowledge. In the mid-18th century, when Abdul Karim, a minor Timurid functionary based in Delhi but born in Kashmir, wrote about his travels through Iran, he used this universally known feature of Kashmir to create linkages with Mazandaran, a small region in Iran, through homology. So though Abdul Karim's affiliation is clearly with Kashmir and Timurid rule Hindustan more broadly, the specificity of Kashmir's paradise-like qualities did not preclude the same in other places. In his account, local knowledge about Mazandaran is something he sifts through, sometimes incorporating, sometimes rejecting, according to more trans-regionally recognized knowledge. And I'm just going to put this slide up of this quote, but I'm not going to read it. I'm going to let you look at it. And basically what he kind of says in this quote is, he's talking about the previous state of the passage between Astarabad and Mazandaran, the changes wrought by the Safavids, information about the climate, which he likens for his audience to Bengal. So he begins with local knowledge, where many of his and he then kind of creates relationships to make it intelligible. And the likening of the climate to Bengal is something that many of his immediate readers in Delhi would know about, but they might not have been to Bengal themselves. Many would not have, right? Furthermore, Abdul Karim transfers the script according to which the Timurids had territorialized their authority to explain the Safavid relationship to their own paradise-like land of Mazandaran. So he marks Mazandaran's similitude with Kashmir by noting that just as the emperors Jahangir and Shah Jahan would go often with their entourages to Kashmir, likewise Shah Abbas would go to Mazandaran with, quote, some of his intimates and attendants for feasting and enjoyment. So the two places are framed not just by their similar natural beauty, but also because they both act as a destination for the contemporaneous kings of two Persianate dynasties who held them in special regard as places to pass certain seasons. So beyond a basis for 17th century Timurid imperial ideology, by the 18th century, this reference to Kashmir was universal Persianate knowledge. A lot of people who had never been near it, including Persians writing in Iran, referred to Kashmir as a paradise-like place of temperate weather and heavenly gardens. That a Timurid functionary could recognize and articulate this kind of imperial placemaking amongst the Safavids speaks to a trans-regionally legible and shared political practice, but also to shared modes of giving places meaning. And with respect to Mazandaran's cultivated places, Abdul Karim, for instance, describes Ashraf near one of Shah Abbas's gardens. And he basically says that, he says that it's very beautiful and that however noteworthy it may be, he nevertheless relates that the locals refer to the Caspian as Wulzum and that this was wrong. And he cites textual sources in support of this authority. And so while he's sort of making a correction to local knowledge here, and while he levels the claim of error, it's not meant empirically in the sense of truth, whose meaning cancels another out according to a categorical distinction of mutual exclusivity. He's basically here following a commemorative tradition of including multiple historical narratives of relative verifiability about the past and its meaning. So he still includes this local knowledge as part of what Mazandaran is, in addition to adding the more universally recognized correct information he provides alongside of it. But both of them are worthy of commemoration. So his view of Mazandaran's people is quite sympathetic. And he claims that, he says that the people of Iran tell strange tales with regards to the inhabitants of Mazandaran about their simpleness, right? And most likely they are, in spite of the Mazandarani's elegantly adorned characters, and in truth have no basis, or else because, since they call Mazandaran paradise-like, it will be for this very reason, that the people of heaven are simpletons. And then he says, it's an amazing coincidence that in Hindustan, they call Kashmir Janat Nazir, and in Iran, they call Mazandaran Behesh Nishan. And because of these paradise-like qualities, the people of both domains subject the poor Kashmiris and Mazandaranis to much abuse, and he uses the word sarzanesh. So I think this quote is significant because here he's saying that Kashmir and Mazandaran are not the same, but their domains are synonymously paradise-like. And according to the relationships of their inhabitants vis-a-vis the rest of their respective empires and their domain's significance for its imperial rulers, they become homologous, right? And it's not just because he's sympathetic towards his subject, but it's really about the parallelism he draws between his Kashmiri homeland and the envied and abused people of Mazandaran, right? And this kind of formulation articulates an intimate similitude based on geographical and political homology. So his privileging of universal knowledge definitely inscribes hierarchical valuation, but including local knowledge alongside and within the framework of homology avoids Orientalism's production of alterity, or else the effacing domestication of what was conflictual and thus threatening, right? So significantly, Abdul Kalim's amendments to local knowledge are also here enacted by a Hindustani Persian on a Safavid locality, which I think helps kind of disrupt anachronistic associations of Iran as the authoritative center of Persianate ways of knowing. But in the midst of this correction, our universal Persian is also simultaneously a Hindi speaker, a Kashmiri empathizing with Mazandarani's plight in Iran. And I sympathize with this because the Kias are from Mazandaran. So according to a Persianate geographical understanding, certain places like Kashmir were understood to be paradise-like, whether or not an author had been there or the place within the smaller domain, or the place was within the domain to which they were affiliated. These understandings could then be extended to incorporate and make sense of other places as related, right? Okay, so back to the book. So the chapters in part 2, Origin, examine the meaning and labor of origins among Persians in Iran and Hindustan, outside of the binary of native and foreigner. I begin with the common modern assumption that a homeland in the Safavid kingdom established a primordial Proto-Iranian loyalty that marked all migrants to Hindustan, even those in Timurid imperial service. And this is a common refrain in scholarship. Modern scholarship possesses limited conceptual means by which to understand origins outside of mutually exclusive categories taken to be definitive of affiliation. Place is given prominence along with religion, nationality, and ethnicity. As with place, I argue that modern categories are either not definitive or else entirely inappropriate. So chapter 4, Lineages and Their Places, argues that the form of origin was lineage, but it's multifariously constituted. Alongside territorialized notions of origin, they were often far more important lineages that were not just natal, but also included those of service, learning, aesthetics, and practice, which call into question our understanding of meaningful connection. So let me go back. Let me go to this map because I'm going to give you examples from two 18th century Persians writing in Aurangabad. Ghulam Ali Azad Bilgrami's biography of Morshid Ghali Khan Mahmud demonstrates the way learned lineage fits into the overall origin, overall story of origin. And so this is a kind of example of how this is narrated. And I'll let you look at it, right? But it's sort of important that this is somebody who has an original name. His father comes to Hindustan, and this is in the port of Surat. And this, his original name, Mirza Lutfullah is someone who comes to be called Murshid Quli Khan, and he has a learned lineage that becomes very, very important and leads back to, right, Agha Hussein Khansari, who was a very important late Safavid scholar. So born in Surat, Murshid Quli Khan had links elsewhere. He's a son of a migrant from Safavid domains and educated by another migrant in Surat, who was a student of one of the most illustrious late Safavid ulama. The benefits of this kind of service included location in a learned lineage that roots itself across Hindustani domains. We actually meet a lot of different people in a lot of different places in Hindustan who can trace their learned lineage back to Khansari. The benefits of this, so the other half of the entry, which I haven't given here, mirrors these exalted origins with details of illustrious patrons and high positions in Bengal and Hyderabad. So learning and service, this is just one example of the connection, but learning and service were amongst the most important lineages that commemorated origin. And the next example I want to show you is one that doesn't link back to Iran necessarily, but has the same sort of format, right? So in the preface to his Tazkere, Gul Rana, Lakshmi Narayan describes himself as, pen name Shafiq Aurangabadi, who from the beginning of eternity has His Excellency Azad Bilgrami's brand of slavery on his forehead. Writing in Aurangabad, he identifies himself as Aurangabadi, which when uttered in that place seems to indicate an immutable and autonomously native identification. Yet, Shafiq is speaking to an audience broader than his own locale. He calls himself Aurangabadi, speaking to Persians from elsewhere or in another locale. He introduces himself with a proper name, a pen name, and a place name moniker, before distinguishing himself as literally marked by his teacher. Sayyid Ghulam Ali Azad Bilgrami is the noted poet, scholar, and participant of the prominent Naqshbandi Taqiyya of Aurangabad. Shafiq's relationship with his teacher is a lineage of knowledge, part of his origin. So later in his biography, before mention of his birth, he narrates this story, right? And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I've put it up here for you. And I think what's very important about it is a little bit more towards the bottom, where he describes his father, and he says, favored with the deputyship of the paymastership of the Deccan, he incorporated service to the dervishes with service to the nobles. He always observed the manner of conferring the kindness of favors, and my father accomplished both forms of dignified service according to all of the necessary customs. Right, so here Shafiq's origin are in terms of what we would call jati, which is not a term he uses, and paternal ancestry, alongside and intertwined with lineages of teachers and patrons. His origins and their names, Khatri Kapuri and its sub-designation, Lahori and Aurangabadi, imperial and paternal, come together to make him a Hindu, a Timurid administrator, and a Persian man of letters. Prominent in this story is his father's mastery of adab, as ethics appropriate to his social location in imperial administrative service, which is a product of many other relationships. Rai Mansaram's perfect enactment of the expected customs of conduct towards all kinds of people, from the masters of the hidden world, dervishes, to those of the manifest world, nobles, indicate the basis of Shafiq's own learned potential as a master of adab. His account of his own origins is typical in its primary emphasis on genealogies and in the specifics of his occupation. In the midst of these origins, place appears, but does not alone constitute origin. Rather, place was almost always bound up in other kinds of lineages and seldom singularly given. So chapter 5, Kinship Without Ethnicity, looks at pre-modern notions of social collectives, commonly called tribes or ethnicities. Dispensing with these terms, I historicize social collectives through the adab of their telling. I find connection between the more usually recognized lineages of birth, legal status, and the various socially regulated relationships, which were customarily formal. The variety of lineages constituting origin require a reconsideration of kinship that dislodges law and birth as definitive. A historicized reading of origin thus defies modern categories like nation, ethnicity, or tribe, and requires a reconsideration of kinship that dispenses with anachronistic notions of biological truth. Chapter 6, Naming and its Affiliations, takes the previous chapter's more expansive notion of kinship and considers the ways in which naming captured the possibilities of affiliation. And in particular, I elaborate on the regionally specific ways in which Persians called themselves and each other, and how trans-regional circulation accommodated such specificities. Names of both individuals and collectives linked people to groups and to each other in ways that were relational, contextual, and thus belie the discrete mutual exclusivity of modern categorization. And I know there's a lot in these descriptions, and unfortunately, I can't give examples for all of them. But I'll sort of talk a little bit about this in my description of the last chapter, which kind of brings together issues from the previous sections. So changing political and economic factors in the 18th century challenged social connections and collective affiliation, raising the stakes for commemoration for societies facing fracture and reconstitution in both Iran and Hindustan. So the last chapter focuses on Tazkere writing in the aftermath of imperial devolution, focusing on the insight they offer into possibilities for articulating collectives and selves. I specifically look at poetic Tazkeres here, which commemorate aesthetically and socially constituted collectives of Persians. These included past and contemporary poets as part of an imagined community of ancestors and peers, in which were nested networks of social relationships. So the act of writing such a text was autobiographical, but the self of Persianate autobiography was accumulated and continually redefined in the context of social relationships over a lifetime of learning, travel, and service. These texts evince a self brought forth in connection with various collectives, figured according to Adab's imperatives of moral self-fashioning, continually reiterated in conduct in connection with the world. The sheer number and diversity of such texts enunciate the many possible ways these collectives could be imagined and their selves brought into being. Pre-modern Persians could be affiliated with a multiplicity of places and have diverse origins that little resembled those demanded by nationalism. So in the time that remains, I'm going to focus at what was at stake in commemoration, because I think this is a kind of important component of the book. And the very act of remembering, brings together memories in particular ways. Moreover, commemoration is an act of memory undertaken together, right? There is a writer and then there are readers. The commemorative texts that are the sources in this book recollect various assortments of figures, inviting readers to join their authors in these acts of remembering. Commemoration also had a moral stake. So memory served to maintain mindful awareness, a deliberate action that made it the guarantor of morality, which required discernment and judgment. So to act correctly in a given situation, one had to be able to remember both from previous knowledge and from experience. In turn, cultivating moral integrity guarded against memory's loss. So one of the things that I think is important to remember is that proper ethical and aesthetic forms as actions in the world and as remembered narrative assemblages protected people individually and together from descent into immorality caused by forgetfulness. So Tazkeres, to kind of go back to the text, are an exemplary form of commemorative texts that blossomed in late 15th century Timurid Herat. Either standing alone or contained in court chronicles, they vaunted the learned figures that adorned the courts of Persianate empires. Tazkiras appeared in clusters where unstable times led to the need to record lives worthy of remembrance. These lives and the collectives they commemorated were collectives of adab that manifested moral order. So in times of upheaval or transition, when moral lives were more difficult and in ethical subjects connections more challenging to maintain, Tazkiras preserved moral possibilities for better times. And perhaps unsurprisingly, as imperial structures began to unravel through the 18th century, the writing of these texts proliferated. Commemoration's moral significance also points to its political stakes. Tazkiras' collective moral possibilities in their very multiplicity, they were overlapping, right? The figures were continually, some of them remembered across different kinds of assertions. And I think it's also important to note that a poet was also a statesman or a Sufi, and could be sort of from various kinds of social stratas. And they were included even as they were hierarchically differentiated. Hindus and women were also hierarchically differentiated from, but nevertheless placed separately or together with Muslim men. This supple and expansive plurality engendered by apparatic belonging allowed collectives to reassert themselves when the political structures that sustained societies failed. Commemorative collectives could also be the basis out of which new political structures asserted themselves. And this explains the proliferation of Tazkira production in regional kingdoms from the mid-18th to the early 19th century in Hindustan. So Tazkiras assembled their subjects under different rubrics. But even when limited to a locale or a kingdom, most Tazkiras included Persians from a variety of origins, narrated according to common narrative codes that remained broadly meaningful far beyond that limited sphere, right? And one example, and I'm going to reference newer scholarship, Shayan Rajani, for instance, has written on how 18th century Sindhi Tazkiras and poetic anthologies regionalized Persian poetry by commemorating people and their verses who had spent time in Sindh, sometimes only several years. Thus, poets elevated their region ethically through its embeddedness in a larger Persianate adab. So I think one of I want to kind of check on time here. I think I've gone on quite a long time. And I was going to give you another example, but I think I'll kind of stop here and wrap up. And I think that the kind of most important thing I wanted to say is that Persianate Selves makes a claim for what it meant to be Persian before nationalism, but also addresses itself to the violence and exclusion of modern nationalist politics and the limitations of its forms of knowing. Ultimately, my contention is that we cannot find our way out of the conundrums of the present by only looking within modern limits. I wanted to look at an earlier time when ways of seeing and being in the world were different, not to return to them, but as inspiration for imagining new futures. And one of the things I talk about in the coda, in the conclusion of the book, is the way in which some of these features that I discuss historically are still with us today, but their overarching logic has been destroyed. And yet the things that linger are still there for us to learn how to see and hear again, right? So I consider the book a beginning, an opening invitation rather than a definitive last word. And I'm very interested in your thoughts and questions, as a number of the aspects of the argument in this book about circulation, about adab, and their constitution of the Persianate world in material and imaginative terms are more explicitly addressed in the next book. So thank you again, and that's all.
Thank you so much, Mana. I'm going to be moderating this discussion. People can ask questions in the chat box if they like, and I will read them out to Mana. Or you could unmute yourself and ask the question, but please raise your hand virtually first, and I will call on you to ask your question. If someone wants to speak in Farsi, they might do that, but Puya and Daryush will help us to translate. I'm going to abuse my position as a moderator and quickly ask you a question before things get out of hand. I was just looking at your subtitle, Memories of Place and Origin Before Nationalism. And as you kept on speaking, I kept thinking there should be another term there in the subtitle, and that term is language. So, because it somehow seemed that although you had elaborated the question of adab as a set of practices, aesthetic and otherwise, it's adab is also vocabulary. At least it seems like that in India, and so it's also a question of language before nationalism. There is some work, to my limited knowledge, there is some interesting work by Farooqi and others on for example, the Persian dictionaries that were mostly produced in India in the 19th century. So I wondered if that is slightly out of your period, or maybe in the next book you will be actually exploring further this question. But I somehow wondered that while place and origin are so wonderfully elaborated in your work, I would have wanted more. That's to do with the question of language.
Thank you for that question. I mean, I would be very interested in hearing what you mean a little bit more about what you mean about what adab is a vocabulary. Certainly the kind of work that's been done on language before nationalism, I mean, the dictionaries are very helpful to understand. And the work that I have looked at, I think actually helped me think about Persian as regionally differentiated across these smaller domains, because it's very easy to think about, well, Persian in Iran versus Persian in India. But actually the scholarship on dictionaries helps us understand, for instance, that even within a place like Iran, people in Azerbaijan, right, thought that people were using Persian incorrectly in Khorasan. Right. I mean, within Iran, there are regional differences in the idiom of the spoken language, and there's a different familiarity with vocabulary. Right. Not every word in the Persian language was used and as familiar. And you can see this particularly in commentaries on classical texts. And one of the things I've looked at the most are the different kinds of commentaries on the Golestan, for instance, right, or Rumi's Masnavi. And, for the people in the 18th century, 17th and 18th century, that's quite distant. It's hundreds of years old. And this is Persian necessarily written in a different region. And so certain words and idioms are unfamiliar to people in particular places, right? And so they need to be explained and glossed. And so there is a way in which what you can see is the unevenness is inherent to Persian as a trans-regional language, right? And this is kind of what fueled various kinds of disagreements about proper idiom. And I think that's very helpful for understanding, and this is something I talk about in the second book, the kinds of arguments that people like Farooqi and others outline about who has the authority to dictate proper usage, right? And that's something that happens in Iran and in India, but actually those two discussions are not connected. And I have a kind of argument about why that is. And it really is quite specific to the changing kinds of circulations. Iran in some ways becomes a little bit provincialized in the 18th century and cut off from many networks of circulation that it had previously enjoyed, in a way that Hindustan does not as much. And I can't really go into that, but the scholarship on language before nationalism that I found really helpful was Sheldon Pollock's work. Simply because one of the things he talks about is that there is no such thing as a native language before nationalism, right? You can think this, and he sort of traces the way this very idea actually comes out of modernist thought, right? That is the basis for nationalist thinking, because you have people that have first languages, but languages were contextual and specific. So somebody might have spoken a language at home and a language outside and a language of learning and a language of prayer. And these might not have been the same languages, but they may all have been learned in childhood, right? So which is the native language? None of these people necessarily vaunted the language, their mother tongue, the language spoken at home or by their mothers was not the language they associated with the most, prominently, or that they were most proud of, right? I mean, so by thinking about a native language as a mother tongue, as a, this does not make sense in a pre-modern context. So that was very helpful for me to think with and think through, partly because these were really multilingual contexts, even if you weren't highly educated. And really the travel texts were the most interesting ways to see these, because people, one of the places I see this, for instance, is Abu Talib's travels, where he comes back overland from, this is his famous travelogue to England, but I focus on the places where he's traveling through India and through Ottoman regions. And when he's traveling, he sort of marks different places where the nobles and the common people, what languages they speak and when that changes. And both kinds of people are multilingual, as he himself is. So that I found that very, very interesting.
I'm sure I'll have many more questions along the same lines, but we'll have to keep that for an occasion when maybe we can have you over in person. Thank you, Mana. Let me read out a question from Sandeep Dayal, who says, in the 1700s, what was the relationship or shared, unshared values between Persianate adab and Muslim Quranic ethics, and also Persianate adab and Hindu dharma? Would you want to take a couple of questions?
I can do that. I helps me to write things down.
Oh, okay.
So I have gotten a grasp of that question. And if there are other ones that you want to share, I can.
Yeah, there's one more. I'm not sure I completely understand it, but I will ask it anyway. Simran Govani wants to know, as the Persian language and traditions are fading away, how are they being kept alive by the natives or other people? And how can we also revive the culture, especially in a world where people are something towards languages and traditions that are good for materialistic benefits, for example, French or Spanish? I think Simran's concern is about how people are learning languages today, and especially in college, which will help them to, get better jobs, or rather than learning something like Persian. Speaking from the Indian context, it's where Persian is not a native language. I think this is the source of anxiety of the questioner.
I mean, is the question, why should we learn Persian, and how will it help?
How do we keep them alive when people are becoming materialistic and learning French and Spanish?
Okay.
Yeah, these are the two questions we have as of now. Would you like to address them?
Sure. So with the first question, I think it's important, and this is something, again, I did not get into in this book. I didn't have a chance to really think through in a good way the relationship between, whether we call it Quranic ethics or Islam, and this thing that I'm calling the Persianate. I think that it's very clear, and I think a very good example of this is Shahab Ahmad's very important book, What is Islam? I think it's very clear to me, and you can see this the most when reading some of the scholarship on Sufism. Adab is very important in an Islamic context. It is not, this thing that I'm calling Persianate adab is not separate from Islam, right? There, in some ways, you can actually say that there is no Islam without adab. because one had to, the kind of epistemological logic of adab was very, very important for the kind of ontology of belief, right? There is no belief separate from the embodiment of it, right? So one cannot, it's related in some ways to one had to do in order to be, ultimately. And so this idea that Quranic ethics is separate from adab, I think that adab is in many ways an articulation of it, but there is some flexibility, right? Where the way I always explain it is that in a number of contexts, the explicitly Islamic nature of it could be pulled a bit out of focus and blurred, and people could focus on a more universalized ethical understanding. And this, by connection, this is also something I'm describing, which is a kind of translational strategy, right? So the specificity of its Islamicness could be pulled out of focus a bit, not obliterated necessarily, right? And what could be emphasized was the more universally kind of Persian adab part of it. And this could be used to resonate with other traditions in that kind of parallel homologous way, right? And this has been talked about. You can see this talked about in the way that people who are not Muslim are praised on the basis of something that we can call adab, but we can also trace to a very kind of Islamic understanding of ethics, right? So this idea of loyalty, of being true to your word, of having certain kinds of virtues, right? Which we can also identify as the names of God in the Islamic tradition, right? People were understood who were not Muslim to also be capable of embodying sifat, right? And sifat were virtues, and they were qualities of God, and God embodied them in the most perfect way, right? And we all, as human beings, aspired to come close to that perfection as much as we could in our own imperfect way. So that there was a kind of resonance with that. And Dharma, I mean, other people have written about this much better than I can address it here, but Dharma, I think, is also this idea of embodied virtue. And there is a resonance, and people have seen a resonance and described it very much that way. And I think that some of the most interesting place to see this is not just in the writing of Hindu Persians, but also in the kind of way in which many Muslims, some of whom came from Safavid Iran, were very interested in thinking through and with these kind of Sanskrit forms of knowledge, right? And exploring and thinking about the relationship and what that meant about certain kinds of universalist ideas. And the universalism of these ideas actually was also understood to be proof of Islam's perfection, right? And this is a very different way of thinking than we have now. And that's very unfortunate, but it's something I would really like to elaborate more on in the context of the next book project. The second question is a very important question. I don't know if it's one that I have a very good answer for, about how to kind of keep these ways of thinking alive and to encourage their spread when, learning, languages, in India, when people are kind of really thinking about their material well-being, which is not unrealistic, right? Which I think is important. We're not all just about our spirits. One needs to be secure and have basic well-being, but that's very difficult in a neoliberalized context, right? We are living in a neoliberalized age where even the pursuit of education and learning has become instrumental. And that's a real problem. And I actually think that's a political problem. And I don't know if there's an easy answer to it, but I think that in my work, I try very much to link the past to the present, and make clear some of the features of our present that make not just seeing some of the things I'm describing a problem, but also structure the institutional logic that dissuades it, right? And for me, I think one of the biggest problems is the neoliberalization of everything, including learning and education and institutions of higher learning. So, I mean, I see that here in the United States, where all of our students, where, you know, liberal arts education that teaches certain kinds of critical thinking and is basically being replaced by majors and the pursuit of knowledge that is going to most give you a return on your investment, right? That's the way it's thought about. So I think just being aware of our present moment and the kinds of things like, well, one goes to college to, you know, get a degree that will enable, you know, money-making capabilities. Being self-conscious about where that comes from, I think, is an important first step, so that you can start making decisions about, yes, I need to be okay and live and eat, but do I need to turn my entire education into that? So, I mean, that's not a very good answer, but I definitely don't have all the answers.
Thank you to the two who asked questions. We're open to taking some more. You can also unmute yourself and ask. Hussein Manucheri. Go ahead, please, Hussein.
سلام، روز بخیر. از آقای پویانپوی خواهش میکنم این سوال من رو ترجمه کنم برای خانم پروفسور ماناکیا. من حسین منوچهری هستم، مدیر داخلی مردم نامه. میخواستم اگر بشه خانم کیا لطف کنم و توضیحی درباره این بدن که در حال حاضر در دانشگاه‌های بیرون از ایران چه پژوهش‌هایی درباره پدیده ایرانی مآب در حال شکل‌گیری هست و ایشون در واقع بر اساس همون کار کردن در مقالاتشون، در پژوهششون، چه آثاری در واقع در حال شکل‌گیری و انجام هستش. خیلی ممنون.
Yeah, could you do a summary translation, please?
Sure, I'll do that. Hussein is basically asking if what are the kind of or extent of research on the question of the Persianate culture. Of course, he's translating it with a different term that we had a little bit of difficulty, but generally he's asking what is the status of the current research and where is the direction of this research going to in this field. Thank you.
So I can take more than one question if that's helpful. We can continue this format.
I think that Murari has a question, my colleague, and then Dariush.
Yeah, thank you, Darshan. Thank you, Tejaswini. Can I ask now? Okay. Yeah, thanks for your talk. I think it was great talk on book. I look forward to reading. I haven't done it, so I think I'm looking forward to read this book. But my question is, I was wondering whether your sources that you've seen, Persian immigrate or settle in Aurangabad or other parts of India, whether these sources allow you to capture their understanding of the things in the 18th century. As we know, all the land-based Islamic empires are under stress from the maritime European forces. So whether there was some sort of an anxiety, some sort of some reflections in the sources of the early 18th century when you're writing on Persian Selves. And I would second, just related to this, whether you also consider Armenian, I mean, whether you have perhaps some writings by Armenians, and whether you consider the Armenian merchants among the Persian cells, who, because they were the ones who got uprooted from New Julfa in the 17th century. And I wonder how they kind of, think about these situations in the 17th, 18th centuries.
Is it okay if I just answer those questions before taking more? Okay, so the research on the Persianate outside of Iran. خیلی ممنون برای سوالتون. I mean, it's something that has, this Persianate is a term that was sort of coined by Marshall Hodgson in his multi-volume book, The Venture of Islam. But it's really only in the last 25 years that there's been a kind of, it was sort of picked up and there's been a much broader engagement with it. Now, one of the things that has happened is, and this is kind of what spurred my work, is that I felt like there was a lot of disagreement about how to use it, what is it, and a lot of that is being discussed right now, right? Does Persianate just mean Persian speaking? Does it refer to more kind of effervescent cultural forms, right? That can move past certain languages, right? Can we think of certain things that exist in, the understanding and language of Armenians or in Urdu, can these be understood as Persianate? And then there is a set of disagreements, partly on the basis of the fact that it's very easy to turn that into a discussion about influence, and to make and therefore re-inscribe Iran as the kind of central authority and locus of Persian that just kind of emanates outward. And what you get left with is, Iran and its cultural colonies, right? Instead of, I think, something that's a bit more accurate, which is understanding this as a kind of realm with forms of circulation that need to be understood, right? And there are certain kinds of nodes that are very important at different times, and they shift over time. And one of the things that's very interesting about the 18th century is this is and you can think about it as the long 18th century, but this is a period where you can see the shifts in some of the important nodes of Persianate, of the Persianate world, right? So this is a kind of period of time where you can see kind of Delhi falling away, right? And the locus of the Persianate kind of relocating to other cities in the subcontinent that become various kinds of sites, whether they're ports or they're regional centers, right? And a similar type of thing starts to happen in Iran, where you have, Esfahan is kind of decimated, and you have huge population flows that kind of change. Now, there's also been a way in which people in Islamic studies have been grappling with this concept of the Persianate. And it's very, a notable example of this is Shahab Ahmad, who I mentioned before. He categorically rejects the term. And he does so because he says, like, this is ethnocentric, right? But I think he goes through so much trouble to kind of dispel the assumptions around what is Islamic. And he sort of doesn't really seem interested in trying to do that with the Persianate, which is fine. But yet the kind of things that he describes very much resonate with what I call adab. And I think it's very interesting that the moment that his idea of what is Islamic collapses is when Persian as a trans-regional language collapses. And what he's talking about, the Balkans to Bengal, is also something that we can understand as the domain of circulation of Persian as well. So again, I don't think we have to choose one or the other. I think that's I like to think that the most productive direction that I would like to see Persianate studies going into is to use Persianate adab as an analytic and theoretical basis for understanding the Persianate. And I think that will give us the most richest understanding. So this is, to me, what I understand to be decolonial, right? We don't just look at adab as a subject of study. We also, it's not an object of study. It's something that we also use as an analytic. And I think that that can be very rich and fruitful. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but it's a very big question. The second question about kind of, if I understand it correctly, you're asking kind of if these sources and have anxiety or display anxiety about, you know, the rising European encroachment
Yeah.
in the subcontinent.
Yeah.
And they're definitely aware that the Europeans are there. They're definitely aware that, you know, in the second half, the later half of the 18th century, conquests are beginning. But this anxiety is obviously articulated in different ways depending on where they are. I mean, the source that I don't talk about in this book, but I've been reading a lot of is Ghulam Hussein Tabatabai's Siyar al-Ta'akharin. And he is obviously very concerned. And the thing that I find the most interesting is that, so he's very explicitly concerned with the effects of East India Company rule on Bengal, right? But one of the things that I find interesting is that it's really not until the early 19th century that we start to see the effects of colonial rule on Persian ways of knowing. And this is something I talk about a little bit in the book, where you start to hear a difference in how the Mughals, the Timurids, are remembered. And they start to be in the early 19th century called Baburid, which is not something you ever heard before, and which is a reflection of, it's a different understanding of them as a family, and it's a severing of their genealogy from its prominence as Timurid, which was very important and glorious, and all of a sudden that gets cut off and they become the House of Babur. So that's a kind of interesting shift that I think is very much related, and you see it. You see it in the text of people who are trying to learn European knowledge, right? And are very aware of conquests. You know, this is, I'm thinking here about Abdul Latif Shushtari, who goes from Hyderabad as the representative from the Nizam to Calcutta, and he spends time there learning, and he's trying to grapple, right? He's very aware that these are the rulers, and he's the representative of, you know, a sort of regional power to this, you know, by this point, right, by the late 18th, early 19th century, a very formidable power in the subcontinent. I do think at the same time, a lot of these people who are writing, someone like Tabatabai, they are also taking the position of, that is a very known position of Persian men of letters, where they're trying to educate the new rulers who are, you know, sort of outside of that whose modes of being, socializing, and rule are very much outside of the Persianate, even though a number of them know the language. Right. And these men of letters are undertaking some of the duties of their occupational social location and trying to educate them. Right. And this is a tradition that you could say goes all the way back to the Mongols. right? When the Mongols show up and you have all of these men of letters, and it's like, we need to teach them, right? And so that is also something that you see. As for Armenians, I do think that they are very much part of this. They are very multilingual, and you can even see that at the level of language in the difference between Grabar and the Jolfin dialect, for instance, where it's very permeated with Persian. And the practices of these merchants and the ways that they're very easily acting as intermediaries, right? I mean, they're at multiple levels. You can see how they're very, very much a part of this world. Even though, and I look at a particular text, even if they might be they're very anti-Muslim, right? They may profess a profound dislike of Islam and Muslims and all of this stuff, but they still inhabit the forms. And that's very interesting, right? And that's one of the things I try and talk about in the book, is that it's not about agreement or liking. It's about the fact that these are common forms according to which they dislike or disagree with.
I think Dariush can ask his question. I'm not sure we have time for much more than that, unless the question is a small one and can be followed by another small one. But let's see how it goes. Dariush?
Okay, thank you so much for moderating this session, dear Tejaswini, and thank you, dear Mana, for your very excellent and rich presentation. And I have some question about your analysis, your narration in your book, but initially I have to confess that I haven't read your book yet. Just I had some glimpses on it, and I received the PDF file of your book recently, thanks to my dear colleague Puya, and I'm looking forward to read this very important book precisely. But I have a very important problem with your main concept in this book, and it is about the Persianate. And could you please comment on the conceptual boundaries of the term Persianate and what you think is a comprehensive Persian equivalent that captures, as you know, in Iran, the translators use the Irani Ma'ab as a translation of Persianate. Irani Ma'ab is one translation which is frequently used, but it does not appear to fully capture what Marshall Hodgson originally meant by it. So, because you used instead of Irani Ma'ab, Farsi Mada, I would like to know your opinion about this problem. And I have a similar question too about the main concept in your subtitle, I mean place. What we can do with this comprehensive and neutral word in Persian. For example, in your book, we can consider this word as a key concept as Muten or Zadgah or Jai, Zist Jai, homeland, and something like this. And I have some problem with this concept in your narration, but I have to, again, I haven't read your book precisely yet, and maybe some of these questions are not so good, and I would like to hear your comment about this problem.
Can I ask you, I'm not sure if I fully understand what you're saying about place.
Place, yes.
What is your issue with the, I'm not sure.
What's your point in Persian if you want to translate it yourself in Persian? What do you use about this concept in Persian?
Place?
Yes, as translation. For example, if you want yourself to translate your book in Persian, what do you use instead of place in Persian in your translation? Makan, khastgah, zadgah. Yes, this is a problem in your book, I think. And the word of place is so comprehensive. And because this term in your book is a key term, is a key concept. And I would like to hear your clue, your point about this problem.
Okay.
فارسی هم بگم خانم کیا، اگر در واقع شاید دقیق‌تر کوتاه میگم. ببینید اگر خود شما بخواید بنویسید به فارسی همین مطلب رو بنویسید، به جای place چه واژه‌ای رو استفاده میکنید؟ Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah.
This will be the last question and the last answer. I'm sorry we are nearly out of time, but I think this is an important issue of translation and reverse translation. So we'd love to hear Mana speak about this.
Thank you. So sort of starting with the last point, I'd have to think about it. I mean, these issues of translation are important. And, you know, this isn't the first time someone's asked me about the Persianate, you know, how would you translate it into Farsi? I have to admit, I don't have a lot of experience translating academic writing. So this would be a problem that I would want to speak with someone who does about it. I'm not sure. I actually haven't, I've thought about the Persianate and how to translate it a little bit more than I've thought about place. So I don't have I'd have to think about that. I don't have an answer for you now. For the Persianate, I mean, I don't like Irani Ma'ab because that's Iran. Farsi, I think, is very important to be the sort of main key. I think Ma'ab is good. Madar is good. Part of the thing that I would want to, and I'm not, but neither one of them fully satisfies me. I don't think there is such a thing as a comprehensive translation. I think that is not something that exists. And I think that one of the things, especially when you're talking about concepts and not, you know, easy words, when you're talking about concepts, I think one of the things that I take my cue from is the way that it was done historically, where people look for mutual resonances, right? And when there is enough of a mutual resonance, a translation, which sort of means differently than what we have today, can take place. And then also explanation can take place about that which is incommensurable, right? And I think that portion of, I mean, right now our translations don't have a good way to account for that which is incommensurable, because I think that there always is something that cannot be translated. So I don't have a comprehensive answer for you, but I am fascinated with various kinds of translation practices. And I faced this problem when I was translating the verses from Hafez that I put at the beginning of the book, because how can you translate Hafez? You know, how can you translate from a language in a form of verse that depends on iham, when you only have one choice, right? I could translate the verse multiple different ways according to its different resonances, but I picked one, and I tried to bring over something of the meter, which isn't exactly the meter, just because I do think form is important to it, right? But again, it's imperfect, and I don't claim for it to be perfect. I do think that, I mean, so again, to answer the question about the Persianate, I think it's an ongoing discussion, and I would be interested in talking about it. The thing that I'm a little worried about with some of the current ones is that I want to avoid something that gives the impression of a centrality of Iran. And to kind of to use a term that allows for something that's a bit more diffuse. The thing about the Persianate's conceptual boundaries is something I hope to further elaborate on in my second book. Some work has already been done on this. Niall Green's edited volume, The Persianate World, is very interesting for thinking through this question. But I wanted to look at the temporal and geographic and social boundaries of it, and kind of where Persian becomes, you know, where it no longer exists. But I do think that when we think about conceptual boundaries, we have to think about them much more porously, right? It's not a kind of hard modern boundary. So again, this is also something to kind of think about. Thank you for your question. I think it's very appropriate as the last question, because it leaves us all with things that we need to think about further.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks to Dariush,
Thank you so much.
for helping to pull this together. Thank you for introducing us to Mana Kia. Thank you so much, Mana, for a brilliant talk. I wish there was more time for us to bring questions to you. But I think it's very correct to end on the note of porosity, incommensurability, and imperfection. It leaves us waiting for your next book.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak.
Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks to the audience.
Many thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. I hope see you
Khuda
again.
Hafiz.
Khuda Hafiz. Khuda Hafiz.